Hi. Okay, well, here's a whirlwind tour of getting started with Unity. So power up the app, click New to start a new project, call it what you want, and pick 3D if you're starting a 3D project. I've got some assets that I would recommend just to get us started. Install them before, if we do have a chat session, just install them before we do that. And also some core assets and packages that you can import from here. So first things first, import package, import characters. This is pretty common to importing in Unity. It shows you this import package window. If you're importing stuff from the asset store, it's worth keeping an eye that it's not overwriting something that's already existing in one of your own in your own project. It's a kind of a tricky one to manage. Sometimes you do need to update, and sometimes it's best to be left alone. The advice is always been, let me just click import and let that do it in the background, but the advice is always obviously use version control. Some people even recommend importing into a blank project and then exporting from there and then importing into yours, so doing a kind of a two-stage process. These assets come with Unity. When you installed it, you should have ticked, I can't remember what they call it, but it'll be like core assets or demo assets. Just if you don't see it, just uninstall and reinstall, make sure that you've got that selected. So we did characters. I'm just going to do cameras. These aren't the best, but they're a good kind of quick, easy start. And in the environment, this will be things like trees, and you can see already there's some of what's coming in we've already imported, so it's all coming in into these standard assets. That's what it's called, standard assets. So they're all coming in the same place. They're sharing utilities and cross-platform input stuff, so it's not going to re-import it every time, but it's got things like trees. You can choose, so this is pretty much the same across any Unity package. When you install, you can decide, right, I do want the water folder, or I do or I don't. So I'm just going to import everything for now. Just say import yes. You'll find when you're importing the environment, you'll get some errors in the console, which is down here, generated by SpeedTree, and it's just one of those things. I don't know why, but the packages come in and they need to essentially be, and there's a little warning here. It says the materials need to be upgraded. You need to apply and generate materials. So it's in the environment folder, SpeedTree, and there are 3 trees that come in: broadleaf, conifer and palm. And I just happen to know they've got this little kind of tree icon. If you don't like this kind of long list view, you can change things using this slider. Personally, I'd rather see the text, but it's up to you. So I've selected the broadleaf desktop, apply and generate, and one of those errors is gone. There's another one in that folder which is mobile, and I'll apply and generate that, and then I'll do the conifer, apply and generate, and the palm tree. It's just one of those things, sadly, that you've got to do when you import the environment standard assets. So what have we done? We've done cameras, characters. There'll be our first person, second person controllers. We've done the environment. That's probably all we need for now. And then I've kind of made a list of some stuff that I would recommend just going out to get. Unity's really good for the asset store. There's lots of free materials, stuff that you can buy quite often. So for example, the cameras is a good example. I find the Unity standard camera is a bit poor. You can code your own, but actually people have made some and selling them. There's some good ones that probably will save you a lot of time just to get up and running. But it's up to you. You can do everything from scratch if you'd rather. So there's just some assets, the free assets that I picked out just to get us started making an environment. So you can access the asset store from within Unity itself. You can search, and there's a useful little kind of button that you can choose between paid and free. So you can choose to only look at things that are free. And so I've done a search for Yughues, whoever it is, and free ground materials, and it is this one that I'm thinking of. So I click on it. There's an import button. Import. You'll see it kind of, if you haven't got it downloaded on your local machine, that might actually say download. You click download and then it will change to import and take you to this import window. So similarly, you've got new assets. These are essentially just lots of textures to add to our grounds. I'm going to say yep, download that. And now the other ones I've got kind of just URL, so I might actually do that from a web browser because it's probably a little easier for me to do it that way. So there you go there. And the Unity store is just the same. You kind of, once you've got what you need on there, you just click the open and then it takes you straight into Unity. Asks you to import it. This is just some bushes to decorate the environment. There are a couple of extra ones. So we've done the ground materials, we've done some bushes. Let's get some rocks. They're nice and useful to have. Okay. Packages. Some packages can take quite a while to import. It's just passing through all the textures and working out the best compression to use on them. And if you're swapping from one target build, so if you're swapping from PC to mobile, for example, you'll find that it has to go through and re-import, or not re-import, but recalculate all of these kind of asset hashes and the compression. So you might end up seeing this a few times, especially if you're trying something on desktop and then moving over to mobile. So while this is downloading, I'm just going to copy this next one. So skies in Unity are done via a skybox. Actually, these aren't skyboxes. What I'm using here is a SkySphere. It's a big sphere with the inside being used to display a texture, but I couldn't find some decent free skyboxes. Oh, might have a quick look later, but this is just nice and easy, and I use it actually for mobile development. So VR especially is not a big fan of the traditional skyboxes. They use a lot of draw calls, whereas a SkySphere is a single texture and it's much more efficient. So I've kind of got into the habit of using these spheres instead of the skybox. But I'll show you where the skybox is in a second. Now, you'll sometimes get this if you're importing from an older version of Unity. So sometimes on the asset store, things are old. You know, this is from 2015. So it'll give you a warning. It's going to say it's going to do some updates. Most of the time you're okay. Sometimes it breaks. Sometimes it breaks your own project. So yeah, be mindful. That's why I mentioned just have a look through that import window if it's a critical project that you're working on. So we got that. Is there anything else? Oh yeah, so the post-processing stack. Now, Unity's not really known for looking as good as Unreal Engine. It's one of the things that people complain about, but as I mentioned, they're kind of playing catch up at the moment, and they've got some really great things happening. The post-processing stack is just lots of camera effects that can make your scene look a lot better. So I'm just going to import all of that. So we've done characters, camera, environment from the standard packages, and we've done all of those, so we're good to go. Let that finish. Right, so I'm on an asset store tab, not really looking at my scene yet. There's the scene, and there's another window which is your game window. I've got 3 monitors, so I'm used to kind of spreading things out, but I'll try to just keep things in one place. All of these you can move around and place them where you prefer. I just happen to prefer this kind of setup, but you can find your own way. Different people recommend different things. The windows or these panels you can have more of, so if you're wanting to, an inspector will show you what you've got selected, whether it's in your project window or whether it's in the hierarchy. So the hierarchy is what's in your scene, and your projects, all the assets in the folders. Not when you come to build, not everything in the assets folders actually end up in the build itself, but everything obviously that's in the hierarchy does, because that's in your scene. So whatever's selected appears in the inspector. And nice little trick which I don't see mentioned that often is this padlock. So if I keep this padlock on, even if I select camera, my Palm desktop that I was selected here still appears there. And it's kind of useful if you're doing things like so. You can add a new tab, you can have more than one inspector, and so you might decide when you're doing a lot of work to have 2 sets of inspectors. So one's still locked on my Palm desktop and the other one is on whatever's selected in the hierarchy in the scene view. So yeah, there's a little neat kind of trick, and you can then decide to close the tab, there it is, and unlock. So, and I'm going to try not to go into too much of the detail and just give you a really big overview. So we've got a scene, and scenes, if you go into build settings, move that across, they don't get built when you click build unless they actually appear in your scene settings, in your build settings. And they're the platforms that I mentioned. So if I were to swap over to Android and switch platform, it would have to recompile everything. For now I'll just stick to PC, keep that as is. Most defaults are good to go, but you might say, okay, I want to add this open scene. Now the reason it's opened a window is because it's saying you're adding a scene but you actually haven't saved it yet. So let me do that. It's probably a good time to start talking about, try to keep things organized, because it's easy to get a bit out of hand in your asset folders. So let's call that test scene. There it is, it's the folder I've just made. So you might say, okay, so got some meshes, that's bushes. I could say kind of invite, and you can rename things here. In fact, Unity prefers it if you rename things here rather than on Windows, because it's writing. In fact, let me open. Something you can do is right click, show in Explorer. So these folders are real folders, but they kind of add these meta files that helps Unity keep tab on things. And if you start deleting things in Windows, it kind of gets a bit confused. So yeah, just beware. It probably prefers things, especially if you're moving assets around. It'll internally change all the referencing. Yeah, I'll kind of so make more sense when I start doing environment assets, for example. I'll call that, and I've got my ground texture pack. I've got SkySphere, so I can literally just click and drag and drop these in. What was this one? It's probably the rocks, I think. Yeah, so I can move that in here. You can see it's kind of chugging away and thinking about things. Now that's empty, so I just delete it. Yeah, I do want to delete that. So that just kind of keeps things a little bit better arranged. And the kind of folders you might want to add is scripts. to keep your scripts there rather than just piling up in the root. So scenes in build, we've got test 1, nothing much happening there. When it comes to building, then you just literally click build or build and run if you want to build and see your the results. Not quite there yet. We've got absolutely nothing left in the scene. So we're looking at the game view, which is what your camera is seeing. The scene view is where you would build things. So I'm right clicking here and I'm kind of moving the mouse, and I can look around. Middle mouse button turns it into a handle and I can move around in that way. So left mouse kind of drags, and you can use the middle mouse wheel as well to there's quite a few ways to navigate it. Look on YouTube, and it's kind of a few explanations of moving in the scene view in Unity, but generally I use left mouse button to move around, the wheel to zoom in and out, and middle mouse button click and hold, and just to kind of drag things. And yeah, as you mentioned, it's a bit like 3ds Max. You're in a 3D environment. So not much happening in the camera because we've got nothing in the scene. So first thing, if I right click, create, so you can obviously create cubes and geometry, but what we'll do is we'll create a terrain. We'll have something a bit bigger to work with, and then we'll get one of our guys just standing on there. So as with all, let me zoom out a bit. As with all these 3D things, you're kind of dealing a lot of the time with your coordinates in space. So currently this terrain, and this is the inspector for that terrain, I've got it selected. The transform you'll find exists for any object that exists in 3D space. So the camera has a transform, it's at 0, 1, so 1 up. If you get lost in terms of your orientation, you can look to the top right of the scene view. So Y is up. This differs in different 3D programs, but in Unity, Y is up, Z is the depth axis, and X is the horizontal axis. So we're looking at the terrain. Let me create an empty cube, and it kind of defaults sometimes to weird coordinates. And that little cog thing, if I click on it, I can go reset position. That's a quick way of resetting that to 0. And another nice trick is the F key. So while I'm here, I've lost where this cube is. If I go F, it takes me, kind of zooms the view to immediately to that object that is selected, and you can have more than one object selected, and you can so what am I thinking? Okay, so we've got a cube. I guess the first things first is I'll change the color because it's going to be hard to see white on a white terrain, and we'll start adding textures to the terrain later as well. But just to give you a really quick overview, materials in Unity are just another component on that game object. So these are known as game objects. The terrain's a game object, the camera's a game object. These are all game objects, and the cube's a game object with a mesh on it, which itself has a box collider. So that's to do with physics. So you can't just go through the mesh. It will collide with a mesh, which is, or a collider, which is the shape of a box. The mesh renderer takes from the mesh in the filter, and the mesh renderer also includes a material, which currently it's just using the default material, but we can create our own. So create, looking at assets, and just pick material, and I'm going to call it red. And with that selected, now I'm seeing in the inspector just my red material, and I can change the albedo, drag it across. Now I've got a red material, and to assign it I can select the cube and drop it in here, or actually you can be even lazier and just drag from the project onto the cube itself in the scene. So we've got a cube. It's at a position of 0, 0, 0. It's got no rotation, so rotation on the y-axis is kind of what you'd expect. Control Z, and scale is along the axis. If I give it, Unity by default is using metric real-world units, so that is a cube 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. If you wanted it to be 2 meters wide, you just enter 2 in here. 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters. Now I've got a cube that's twice the size. So that's all very well. You're kind of moving things in the transform component, but you can also use these tools in the toolbar. So by default you'll be using the transform. So as I'm moving over each of the different axes, I can move. So as I'm moving, I can only go, because I've grabbed that x-axis, I can only move along the x-axis, and because I've dragged this one, I can only move on the y-axis. And then you can do kind of a combination of both. You can do along the x and y. It's kind of, it can be useful if you're moving, say, I don't know, a wall or placing something like that, and if you get things wrong, you want it to go back, you can just reset it. The next option is rotate. So it's the same as what we were doing in the inspector. It's just rotating along different axes. So undo, and then you've got a scale tool. So if you grab the middle one, it'll scale uniformly, but if you grab one of the axes, it's going to scale in that way along that axis. So I'll reset, and then this final one is more useful for UI elements. I can't remember what they call it now. I'm hovering, hoping it's going to tell me. No, it's got a name. It trust me, really useful for UI, but for most of your 3D geometry you're only using just to move, rotate and scale. Importantly, these two options will allow you to move, rotate and scale depending on a couple of options. So whether it's local or global, and whether it's the center of your selection or whether it's the pivot of the selection. With only one object, it doesn't make so much sense, but as soon as you start having more than one object, it'll start making a bit more sense. So that's a good opportunity for me to tell you about Control D, which is duplicate. So I've selected the cube, Control D, and I've now got a second cube. If I move it along, and if I select both of them, so I'm just shift clicking in the scene view, but you can also shift click in the hierarchy. And if I change that to local and pivot and do a rotate, you notice that they both rotate along their local pivots, their center of wherever the pivot has been set. If I change back to global and center, then you're rotating the whole of the selection. So it's a global rotation that's local to the center. Okay, so let me delete one cube, reset, and I'm going to use that just because I wanted to explain about it. It's kind of useful when you're using terrains, but also if you're building a map, to know where your center of the world is, and 0, 0, 0 is a pretty useful point. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to move the terrain, which starts off with only one of its corners at 0, and the terrain scales are a bit odd. They're down as 1, 1, 1, but that's obviously not 1 meter. They're actually 500 meters by default. I happen to know that, so I can enter -250 on one axis. I'm just going to move back a bit so you can see it a bit better. So now you're kind of working with a long way away from our 1 meter cube. And on the Z axis, which is that blue axis, I'm also going to type in minus 250, and now we've got our red cube right in the middle of that world. Okay, so time to give it a bit more color. Select your terrain, and the first few are to do with the height of the terrain. Next one is painting textures, then placing trees, then placing things like foliage, trees, grass, bushes. So you can start just molding it as is, but when it's white it's really hard to see all the contours. So I'm going to add a texture or two. You've got some brushes. When you've selected it, just changes the effect of what you're going to be doing. So big brush, a bit hard brush, you can see it's kind of a hard edge as opposed to a really fuzzy brush, and you can change the brush size in here, and the opacity is how much of whatever texture you've got is going to be painted. It's a bit like working in Photoshop, but first of all we need some textures, we need some terrain. So click on that and then go add texture, and let me move this window down. So again, this is the same. You can just decide to make things as a list or look at the pretty pictures by changing the slider. With textures it makes more sense to see what you're painting. So these are not very well named, I have to say. This has come from one of the packages that we've brought in. Diffuse is the first slot here, and then the normal is the next slot. I don't know how much 3D work you've done, but the diffuse is essentially the picture of what your object looks like. So it's also sometimes known as albedo. So I'm just going to pick this basic grass texture and then click on select, and I'm looking for a normal map, and the normal's often this kind of purpley color, and they're to do with it's a height reference. It's a way of writing the height information in a 2D image, which is then kind of rendered using shaders to give it just a bit of relief, a bit of it makes things look not just flat. They're usually in this pink color. I'm not 100% why the ones that are imported on this package just appear as normal, like not pink, but when I select it, it does appear as I expect it to. It is a normal map. It's kind of a pink one. So just going to select. So obviously usually you would pick the same one. I think that's actually the one that belongs to this. It's hard to tell. It's not massively intuitive when you're looking at it as a list. So you can also obviously go through, and we imported this, and that's the way he's going to set them up. So he's got grass, diffuse, normal, grass 2, diffuse, normal. So you can just drag and drop. So that and that, or you want something that's a little bit greener for. So the first texture that you pick is going to be the main texture. I'll do add. So the first texture, as I say, that you pick is going to be the main texture for the environment. And then you can add additional textures. So add. Now I can start looking for other stuff. So no, and then select it. So it's got a little blue line next to it. You can select it. I'm going to make my brush side not ridiculously big, and then as I just click and drag, I'm essentially painting different textures, different ground textures on there. See if you find something that's just a little bit. Yeah, I'll just go with that. So, I just clicked on edit rather than add. So edit, add. Okay, so I got 3 textures to play around with. Now we're dealing with a flat bit of ground, and we need some relief. So first option, raise and lower terrain. Second option, you can actually paint a height, and you enter your height in here and you say, right, I want my, just flatten it essentially to 10. Terrain's a bit odd. It can only ever be at 0 and above, so you can't have a terrain that goes down, which means it's impossible by default to have something like a lake or a river. So a nice trick is you just make everything higher. So I've selected the raise, so I'm going to go for 10, and I can just click and drag, or just go. Flatten's probably the quickest and easiest way. And I just flattens everything to a height of 10. Now, having done that, I'm actually going to bring my terrain down by -10. So I've got, you can just about see that that kind of red cube that I'm using as my 0 reference. It's still there now, but the terrain's been raised by 10, and then lowered within the world. Its transform has been lowered by 10. And the reason I've done that is I can then go into the first option in the terrain, the raise lower, and I'll be able to lower. Lower, you have to click shift, and raise, you don't click shift, you just click down. So I'm going to undo once. The brush size and the opacity, similar to what was going on when we were painting terrain. I find you have to be really subtle with the mountains, because something that I guess may not be immediately apparent is the scale of what we're doing here is huge, and once you get on the ground, mountains just look a lot bigger than you expect, and hills and bumpiness and all those things. So I'm just doing very kind of basic stuff. It's pretty common to make edges a bit higher, just to give a sense of a space. Just going very quickly. And if you find that it's too bumpy and you want to kind of smooth out the terrain, that's what that other option is for. So you can then go just smooth out any bumpiness that you've got on there. We're not really working in detail. I mean, you would quite often just go in and decide to add additional detail and use rougher brushes to make things look a bit better. So that's good. Now I'm going to click shift to make this a bit, and essentially what I'm doing is I'm just making a river somewhere that we'll be able to put some water into. And to get some water, you go into standard assets. I'm going to click on basic, but I think actually water 4 is probably the better of the, actually yeah, why not, we'll use water 4. There's water 4 simple and there's water 4 advanced. They're just more features, more, I mean it all has an impact also on your performance when you're running your game, so it's kind of balancing things. And you can just literally just pick it up and drag it in, and so I can just about see it. You can see it's gone in 10 meters high, so this is where you can start placing it. And just like every other object, it's got a size, so I can make it bigger or smaller. So actually I expect it's probably wider than it needs to be. Yeah. Go back. Actually it does need to be just a little bit wider. Okay. So that's the basics of creating a terrain. I guess while we're here, let's add some trees. You click on trees, similar to adding the textures which we did on the paintbrush. You have to add your trees. Currently there are no trees defined, so it's edit trees, add tree, and the trees are in, again, that's why we imported these. I've got the broadleaf now. I find it easier to look at those in that way, so it's cool. We might as well just go desktop. I've just literally done the same as I did on the textures. I clicked and dragged, and that is a tree. Or the other way to do it is click on the little circle and that opens the picker, and then you've got options. There's some trees have come in from, I think it was a rock asset, yeah, but I'm going to stick with these standard assets. This one's the conifer, and that, with one or the other selected. Similar idea, brush size, brush intensity, tree intensity, so brush opacity is would be the equivalent, and click once. So if I keep holding my key down, I'm just literally drawing lots and lots of trees. Be careful. Trees have quite a big cost in terms of performance, so you kind of have to be a little bit clever. Trees, if I select one of them, you'll notice it's got LOD levels, so levels of detail. So when you're really close up, there'll be 100% detail. As you get further away, they get fewer and fewer polygons. Eventually they get to a billboard stage of just being a flat image, and then eventually they're culled, they disappear. So they're trying to do a little bit in terms of helping the performance, but you still have to be fairly sensible. So I'll select my terrain again, and maybe I'll add a few of the other trees now, the conifers. And similar process with the painting kind of plants. So a detail mesh would be something like the bushes that we brought in. There's a bush, drag it in. And yeah, I think it's just thinking about adding them. Control F. So because of the LODs, we may actually not see them until we're quite a bit closer. Yeah, I think that's what's going on. So I've added this kind of big mesh of what are they called, bushes, which I don't really want. In fact, it's making my computer really chug and